Quantum mechanics, the duality aspect comes in from light, essentially the study of light. And that has a historical trajectory that encompassed everybody from Newton's work, where he talked about the corpuscular model of light itself. We had Young's double slit experiment, for instance, Physio and various others who had worked on that front. Huygens, we had talked about Huygens as well. So these all aspects showed that light has both a wave-like and a particle-like aspect to it. And it was very interesting because it was not only light, but also matter in general was seen to have both the dual aspect of waveness as well as particleness. Recently, it has been found that in the Stevens Institute of Technology, which is in New Jersey in the US, they have found that this duality of particleness and waveness actually comes from this element of coherence, right? Quantum coherence, as it is called. And that is what mediates these two aspects of nature, right? Not only in entities, not only in particles, but also in processes. Recently, we have seen that duality emerges in certain kinds of contexts. So, for instance, in the Large Hadron Collider, which is in CERN, which became famous because of the God particle, right? The finding of the God particle. There, they have seen that there is a certain duality between two different processes. The process basically has, in one of the processes, you have two gluons. Gluons are these very, very subatomic mediators of force, essentially. When we talk about the constituents of protons and neutrons, quarks, right? The things that mediate between them, they are called gluons, essentially. So if you have two gluons and they move to create four, let's say, right? Or those two gluons lead to one Higgs boson and some other gluons, these two processes are found to be dual in nature. Right? So it's very interesting because now we are not talking about entities alone, but we're talking about the processes as well, right? So in Bharatiya Gan Parumpara, we have had the aspect of duality for quite some time. And here we have always looked at it not in terms of laboratories in which light is studied per se, but more in terms of internal explorations of consciousness, so to say. So for instance, to give you a context, we can talk about the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, and in that shlok 4.22, which says, Yadricha labha santushto dvandvatito vimatsarah samah siddhava asiddho cha kritvapi na nibhadyate. Which means that he who is satisfied with gain which comes of its own accord, who is free from duality and does not envy, who is steady in both success and failure, is never entangled even though performing actions, right? So if we go forward from the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, there are various other Maharishis, Maharishi Yajnavalkya, Maharishi Ribhu, for instance. They have shown us that there is a distinction between this idea of I, right? This I am doing something, for instance. When I say I am angry, right? Or I do not like this, right? What we inherently do is we try to create a difference, a distinction between ourselves as individuals and what we are focused on, right? What we are reacting towards, for instance, right? And in the Bharatiya Gan Parumpara, we have seen that these two things may not be all that distinct in themselves, right? There may be something underlying them, which is actually more unifying in certain ways, right? Now, one very interesting story comes from the Laghu Yoga Vasishtha, right, by Maharshi Valmiki, and when we talk about the Ramayana, right, that comes to the fore, and we have chapter 6, part 9, which talks about King Shikhdhwaja. And so King Shikhdhwaja was somebody who renounced his, the pleasures of life, the luxuries that he had, in the move towards going towards realization, essentially, right? But it was found that he actually could not let go of many of the things. I mean, there were certain desires, certain aspects that still remained. And his wife, by the name of Chudala, she realized this aspect, right? She realized this in a certain way, and she saw that he's kind of very superficially trying to get rid of things in a certain way, just because he may have heard about it or he may have seen it somewhere, and he's just trying to replicate that, right? So she then took the form of Kumbha Muni. So
she is an elevated soul.
Yes, so she had realization, she was a realized person in herself, and she realized where the problem was with Shikhdhwaja, and she took the form of Kumbha Muni, and she came forward and made him understand that, just at a superficial level, right, letting go of these aspects is not going to be good enough for, austerity, or you can say realization necessarily. And it's all about letting go of the inner turmoil or the inner kind of attachment, so to say, right? And so then she also took another form, which is of a lady by the name of Madanika, and to kind of entice him and just to test him that has he really understood what is being said, right? And she found to her, great joy that he actually had turned a leaf, right? So in fact, yes,
tangent.
Yeah.
Like she didn't, give away her feminine,
right. And
perspective.
yes.
But still, in today's world, when we talk about the Brahminical patriarchy,
right,
people should know about these things, that
yes,
how
yes,
feminine power has been idealized.
I will say that, later on we will discuss about this when we talk about Shiv Shakti, when we talk about Purush Prakriti. There are so many aspects where the divine feminine has a very important role to play, essentially, right? So in the Yoga Vasishtha, in verse 6.108.31, it is said that, this test that Chudala had done, there's a shlok that comes from it, which says that Shri Vasishtha Uvacha, which basically means that Shri Vasishtha says, right, Evam samtaya tatra sthite tasmin Shikhdhwaje Chudala chintaya masa tat sat vinodashaya, right? Which means that Vasishtha replies, right, after Shikhdhwaja had consented to continue his indifference and disinterested friendship with his only companion in the forest, Chudala was highly pleased to note the nobleness of his mind, right? So that change had finally happened, essentially, right? Now, if we turn to modern neuroscience, right, this idea of what is the self, right? What is the self? Because we always, so in Shikhdhwaja's case, he didn't understand that letting go of attachments by the self is not at the superficial level. It is not at the level of empiricism. It is a much more foundational, much more fundamental letting go, as they call it, right? So in the same way, when we talk about neuroscience today, we see that the idea of self, the self, right? It has to do with certain specific kinds of brain activities, right? And there has been a recent study which said that it has to relate with connectomics. Connectomics is a new area of study which looks at how functional networks come about in these kinds of neural structures or architectures, right? And there was a recent study in NPJ Mental Health, which is a very well-known kind of journal, and it says that people, when they had tried to do different kinds of control experiments with yoga, for instance, Sudarshan Kriya Yoga, there were certain kinds of brain activities that were found to kind of have a little bit of different behavior, essentially, right? So they had done the study with electroencephalography, which is EEG, as we call it, and they found that different components of the technique influenced the brain activity. The main findings were that the relaxed meditative state has only these theta and delta rhythms that are part of it. It also reduces the alpha power, and there is a decrease in the non-repeating brain signals, which is also called the aperiodic activity, essentially, right? So now you will ask that is this saying to us that the self has been curtailed, has been controlled? Not quite, right? Because what this is saying is that it is controlling those aspects which define a certain level of your self, essentially, right? It is kind of the mental processes that has temporarily been stopped or altered in certain ways, right? So we also see that whenever we are talking about the self, when we are absorbed in something, right? We like it a lot. हमें कुछ बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है. We say that start identifying with that thing which we are relating to, right? That becomes a part of us, essentially, right? So the way we understand experience and mental processes, right? There's a lot of rigor in the way the Bharatiya Gan Parumpara talks about it, and also the neuroscientific side also has been speaking about it. Now, when we talk about the mathematics, right, when we talk about information theory, we say that this is an age of information, that it's a data age, all about data, right? So data is structured on duality, right? Data is structured on this idea of bits, zeros and ones, for instance, right? So if you have, let's say, n bits, right, they can encode 2 to the power n different kinds of instances of digital complexity, right? So without this kind of distinction, right, it would not have been possible to have this entire architecture of information theory.